Good evening. Tonight, our democracy is at a tipping point. Our constitutional right to vote and our ability to conduct free and fair elections have been compromised. Anti-democratic lawmakers have effectively targeted voters of color through state voter suppression laws, and they've redistricted Black voters out of power in states like Alabama and Georgia. We're here tonight to say we will not let this stand. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and we're pleased to present live the Frontlines, Protecting Our Democracy, a conversation with journalist Ari Berman. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that has been fighting for worker rights, immigrant rights, racial justice, and voting rights for more than 120 years. Voting rights is our top issue right now, and I think we can agree a top priority for all of us here. In addition to programs that educate us on critical issues, we collectively engage teens, college students, and people of all ages in impactful collective activism, Jewish cultural experiences, and we create meaningful connections to our rich Yiddish traditions and heritage. Tonight's program features a conversation between award-winning journalist Ari Berman and the Workers' Circle Social Justice Director, Noelle D'Amico. We will provide time for Q&A from the audience via the Q&A feature in the Zoom. You're welcome to submit your questions via the Q&A at any time during the program. At the conclusion of this program, we will announce 5 winners of a raffle for Ari's book, Give Us the Ballot. Everyone who's present is automatically entered. And immediately following this program at 8 p.m., everyone will have the chance to stay on this Zoom and take action as we collectively call our senators to insist on the passage of federal legislation to protect every American's right to vote and the integrity of our elections. At the Workers' Circle, we know that working in strong partnerships is how we win the changes our nation needs. And I want to extend a huge thanks to our 34 co-sponsors for tonight's program. You can see them listed in the chat. We're proud to be standing in solidarity with so many incredible organizations. Whether you're here participating live on the Zoom or watching this as a recording, we're glad you're here with us. And we hope that you'll commit to participating in more actions to protect our voting rights. And now it's my pleasure to turn over our program to my colleague, Noelle D'Amico.
Thank you, Anne. We're so pleased to have Ari Berman back with us tonight. Ari is a senior reporter at Mother Jones covering voting rights. His stories have also appeared in the New York Times, the Rolling Stone, the Atlantic, Politico, and the Guardian. He's a frequent guest and political commentator on MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. Ari is the author of a number of books, including Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. And he's hard at work finishing up a new book, Minority Rule, about efforts by white conservatives to entrench power in the face of a massive demographic and political shift. Welcome, Ari. Ari, tonight with you, we'll be exploring voting rights rollbacks, hyper-partisan gerrymandering, election administration and subversion, the rise of minority rule, the role of Congress and the courts, and what we can do to protect our democracy. It's definitely a tall order, so let's dive right in. Ari, in 2021, our nation experienced a tsunami of assaults on voting rights and on our democratic process of redistricting and election oversight. They came at every level and from every direction. As someone who studied the long history of the struggle for equal voting rights in America, did this come as a surprise to you? Why or why not?
Well, hey, Noel, I think I was muted the first time I said hi to you, so hopefully you can hear me now. And thank you so much to Anne and the Workers Circle for sponsoring this, and to all the other groups. And thank you all for all of the hard work that you guys have been doing to fight for voting rights. It's really, really important. It didn't surprise me in the sense that this is an ongoing campaign by the GOP to attack democracy, and an ongoing campaign by Donald Trump to subvert the democratic process. But what surprised me is the breadth of it, that we had an attempt to overturn the election in 2020, which was really unprecedented, followed by an insurrection at the Capitol, which was even more unprecedented. And then since then, there has really been an effort to try to achieve the goals of the insurrection through other means. And it's been so systematic. It's been about trying to make it harder to vote in so many different ways. It's been about trying to entrench power through gerrymandering, so the same people that are making it harder to vote can't be voted out of office. It's taken on new dimensions in terms of trying to actually subvert election results, make it easier to overturn elections. And that all of this is happening at the same time is really disconcerting. And it seems like every single day there's a new attack on democracy, a new strategy unveiled to try to subvert the democratic process. So it's not altogether surprising, but it is very, very alarming. And as we get closer to elections, I'm getting more and more concerned that we are running out of time to reverse this.
Well, Ari, that's one of the reasons we're glad that you're here tonight to help us make sense of all of this as we approach this very critical year where elections will be taking place. For some of you in the audience, you may be trying to get a bird's eye view of what has happened over the past year. So I'm going to quickly summarize just some of what we're calling attacks on our voting rights and democracy that have occurred within the last year alone. And keep in mind, these attacks began following one of the largest turnouts for an election in a century. We have the Stop the Steal movement, casting doubt on President Biden's election, as well as on the very process of election administration. The January 6th insurrection, where President Trump's supporters, encouraged by some Republican lawmakers, used violence to try to stop the certification of President Biden's election. States hired private companies at the cost of millions of dollars to taxpayers to conduct so-called audits of election results, none of which resulted in a different outcome, but which stoked conspiracy theories regarding election fraud without evidence. 19 states passed 34 laws to restrict voting rights, many of which open the door to partisan actors gaining control of running elections and tabulation of results. There's been hyper-partisan gerrymandering of congressional maps during a redistricting process that happens only once in a decade. The Supreme Court diminished the ability to sue over racial discrimination in voting, weakening Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act this year in a 5-4 decision. In January, the Senate sidelined federal voting rights legislation. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which would have set national standards for voting, answered those voting suppression bills, reduced partisan gerrymandering, provided protections against partisan election takeovers, and gotten big money out of politics, was filibustered, and then Senators Manchin and Sinema refused to change the filibuster rule along with every single Republican senator to allow this legislation to advance with a majority vote. So it stalled. Since January, over 250 new state bills to restrict the vote or hand election administration over to partisan actors have begun moving in state legislatures. And just recently, the Supreme Court intervened to allow a newly drawn Alabama congressional map to proceed, despite a lower court ruling that said it was in almost certain violation of the Voting Rights Act because it reduced Alabama's 2 Black majority districts to 1. Ari, help us make sense of this blizzard of attacks. Are they coming from the same source or sources? Are there common themes or arguments that connect all of these actions?
Well, I mean, that's really a stunning list that you read off. I mean, just one of those things in and of itself would have been disturbing, but one after another, after another, after another. I mean, it's simply stunning with seemingly no end in sight. And I think it is all connected because the same people that don't believe in free and fair elections are behind all of these efforts. The same people that tried to overturn the election are the same ones that are passing new voter suppression bills, that are passing hyper gerrymandered maps, that are appointing the judges to the courts. And basically what has happened is the Republican Party has radicalized against democracy. And really what used to happen is, yes, the GOP pushed anti-democratic efforts, but now anti-democratic efforts have become the central organizing principle of the party. And I think that explains everything, that there is a fundamental fear of the people. There's a fundamental fear of democracy by so many in the GOP. And that's why there's a single-minded focus in restricting voting rights through every possible means. And so just as there's a multi-pronged effort to attack voting rights, there has to be a multi-pronged effort to defend voting rights. And I think the single most effective way to have stopped this would have been federal legislation to protect the right to vote. We have to keep pushing for that, because just because it didn't happen once doesn't mean that it can't happen again, and that conditions can't change to persuade people to take a different outcome. But it also means that things have to be fought in different ways, that things have to be fought at the state level, at the local level, that simply giving up just means that the insurrectionists are going to have an easier time taking over.
Wow, fear of democracy itself, that has become a central core of the Republican strategy. And it is indeed alarming as we're thinking about how best to marshal our power to fend off further attacks and to protect our democracy. What would you not have us miss as we're looking at this big picture? What kind of lenses do we need to have on to make sure that we're seeing clearly?
Well, I think first off, it's really important to note that the 2022 election is going to be in many ways a referendum on democracy. It's not going to be about Democrats versus Republicans. It's going to be, do we elect people that actually believe in democracy or not? And I think the people elected in 2022 are going to go a long way towards deciding whether we even have a fair election in 2024. So I would really encourage people, first off, to get involved at the local level. We saw an incredible mobilization in 2020 to help people vote, and people stepping up and becoming poll workers, becoming election officials, making sure that everyone knew how to cast a ballot. And I think all of that attention on voting was one reason we had the highest voter turnout in 100 years, because there was so much attention, not just on the value of voting, but how to make sure your vote was counted. And obviously, a lot of that activism carried over, but I am concerned that some people that were active in 2020 said, listen, Biden got elected, we don't need to do this anymore. And not only that, but a lot of election officials didn't want to do it anymore after being attacked and harassed by Trump supporters. That's created a void. And now what's happened is the insurrectionists are taking over. They are becoming poll workers. They are becoming election officials. They are running for offices like secretaries of state. And if this isn't counteracted by people who care about democracy, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, then the insurrectionists are going to control the election apparatus. And so I would urge people to get involved at the local level and then really raise awareness about these local and state election positions that are so critical. That yes, it's going to be very important what happens with the House and the Senate. It's going to be just as important what happens to Secretary of State races, state attorney general races, governor's races. These were all critically important in 2020. I would argue they're even more important in 2022, given the efforts to subvert the democratic process. So while we have to keep looking for a federal solution to this problem, I think a lot of work can be done at the state and local level to, at the very least, prevent the insurrectionists from taking over.
Ari, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because on this call, we have organizations and members and activists who are committed to precisely that, working at the state level in ways to hold people accountable, to ensure free and fair elections by becoming election monitors themselves, by participating in phone banks to equip voters so that they know how to cast their ballot and can do so to avoid barriers that have been placed in their way wherever that's possible, mobilizing people. So that's an important affirmation to hear. And we absolutely will not let up on demanding that Congress needs federal voting rights legislation to pass. They need to protect our democracy now, and we will keep pushing on all fronts. Now, Ari, you're hard at work working on a book, and I need to thank you because I know you're squirreled away trying to get it done. And I said, come on, do a Zoom with us, Ari. We need to get a picture of where things stand. Tell us a little bit more about your book, Minority Rule. What do you mean by minority rule? Why is this a risk for our nation right now?
Thanks, Noelle. Well, it's nice to take a break and actually see some people every once in a while, as opposed to just poring over books all day. I'm not done yet. Hopefully I will be done soon. But basically the idea is that right now, I believe the greatest threat to democracy is the effort to overturn and nullify the will of the people. And that is being done by a shrinking white conservative minority using anti-democratic institutions and anti-democratic tactics to block the power of a diverse new American majority. And I think what connects all of these efforts, whether it's voter suppression or whether it's rigging the courts or whether it's hyper gerrymandering, is an attempt by a shrinking white minority to entrench power by any means necessary. And that's the ultimate strategy here. Why would you want to overturn an election? Why would you want to prevent people from voting? Why would you want to draw hyper partisan, uncompetitive districts? It's all done to try to insulate you from the voters and to try to insulate Republicans from a demographic shift that is happening, which is we are becoming a majority minority country. We are becoming a more diverse country. We have a political system that is starting to reflect that, and that is threatening the power of a lot of people in charge or who used to be in charge. And so I believe that there's a major political shift happening, not unlike the first Reconstruction or the second Reconstruction, but it's also prompting a furious backlash, not unlike the backlashes we saw, whether it was to Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s, whether to the backlash we saw to the civil rights efforts in the 1960s as well. And so I think we are seeing basically right now two people who have two different visions for democracy. Some people, not just Democrats, but like-minded Republicans, who are okay with the US being a multiracial democracy, who embrace that, who believe that's the way of the future. And there are other people that feel very threatened by that, and they want to preserve the power of a shrinking white minority instead of embracing a changing and demographically diverse country. So I think that's really the stakes we're at. I don't want to get too much more into it because I have a lot more stories to tell when we get there. But I do think that whether or not our government and our institutions reflect the will of the people and the will of the voters is the most significant challenge of our time.
Thank you. Well, Ari, now that you've given us a framework for understanding this moment, let's zoom in and focus on a few of the particular challenges. And I want to begin with rollbacks at the state level on the front end of elections and talk about voting rights and redistricting. Now, when the Senate failed to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act in January, not only did state laws that had already been enacted to restrict the vote continue unimpeded, but 250 new bills are now in play in state legislatures. What are some of the techniques being used to suppress the vote, and whose votes are being suppressed?
Well, I mean, it's really every possible technique you can imagine, whether it's making it harder to register to vote or making it more difficult to cast a ballot, whether that's in person or through the mail, or making it harder to have your vote actually be counted. And we are seeing really some stunning evidence of voter suppression right now. I mean, you look at Texas, where they changed the rules for how to cast your mail ballot, and 40% of mail ballot applications and 40% of mail ballots are being rejected, which is an absolutely staggeringly high number. I mean, I have never seen anything like this since I've been covering voting rights. I mean, 2 to 3 to 4% of ballots rejected is a high number, let alone 40%, simply because of small technical tweaks to the law. And this is one of the things that I've been saying is this is a death by 1,000 cut strategy. Some things are going to seem very obvious. Some things people won't even know about till votes start getting rejected. And that's really one of the things I'm concerned about here, because we published an article about Georgia as well that looked at the November elections, which was the local elections for things like mayor and local races in Georgia. And we found that mail ballot applications were rejected at a rate 45 times higher than in 2020. And people didn't vote once their mail ballot applications were rejected. That was because in Texas, they added new ID requirements. In Georgia, they gave people less time to return their ballots. And people became accustomed to voting a certain way in 2020. And even many red states expanded voting access because of the pandemic. And now we've gone in a much different direction. And the laws haven't changed in one or two ways. If you look at the Georgia law, you look at the Texas law, there's 20 different provisions making it harder to vote. So that means there's 20 different things that you have to do voter education around. So first off, you have to convince people their vote matters in the first place and that they're not going to be disenfranchised, which is now a tougher argument to make. Then you have to make sure they actually know how to vote. And that is a more complicated argument. In Texas, the law is being interpreted in such a way that the ID that you use on your mail ballot has to match the ID that you use when you register to vote. Well, nobody remembers whether they put their driver's license or their voter registration number or their social security number when they registered compared to what they use now. And there's not even a way to check that information. Some people didn't even have those kind of things when people who registered in the 40s didn't even have those numbers compared to now. And so we're seeing a lot of people slip through the cracks. And what we found in Georgia was that this 45 times increase in terms of rejecting mail ballots and then people not voting, that was enough to flip over 30,000 votes in the election, which would have been 3 times larger than Biden's margin of victory. So I'm very, very concerned that we are going to need an absolutely massive voter education effort in 2022, because I don't think you can rely on the Secretary of States in Georgia or Texas or other places to educate the voters, because in many cases, they're the ones that are actually behind the efforts to make it more difficult to vote.
It's truly a chilling moment. And I want to just do a shout out right now to the Center for Common Ground and their founder, Andrea Miller. The Workers' Circle has been a proud partner with the Center for Common Ground, one of our co-sponsors tonight, phone banking weekly into Texas prior to the state's primary to equip voters of color who are over 65 with the information they need to cast their ballots in the Texas primary, where that early voting has already begun. And I want to return to Texas because SB 1 in Texas has made it extremely complex. You're already demonstrating the percentage of ballots that have been rejected. And there's another provision I want to ask you about, and that is that SB 1 makes it a state jail felony for election officials to simply, if a ballot comes in and it's rejected, the election official can't mail you the proper ballot and say, hey, fill this out and it'll be fine. That makes it a state jail felony for election officials to simply send a new ballot to voters. It has election officials reluctant and nervous about communicating with voters at all. And I'm wondering, this is tried and true, the death by 1,000 cuts, confusing applications, ballots, switching processes, ID IDs, where you write your ID number on Texas. I think it's where you would normally lick the flap of the envelope. You have to lick it on the top and lick it on the bottom and sort of scrawl it in between. We've had real trouble dealing with these administrative ways of making it harder for people to vote. But this felony piece, that seems like something new to me. Is that new, Ari? And are you seeing that elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the disturbing trends that we're seeing that is new. And it's part of this broader effort at election subversion. And it's part of this broader effort to overturn what worked in 2020. You know, we gave election officials a lot of authority in 2020 to help people vote. They did things like mail out ballots to people, or mail out applications for people, or open more polling places, or have mobile voting centers to make voting as convenient as possible. And these were broadly popular policies across party lines. And there's been now a severe reaction against them from the insurrectionists. And now election officials could be criminals simply for trying to do their job. And it's created this Kafka-esque situation in places like Texas, where not only are ballots being rejected at an alarming rate, but then election officials can't even send them new ballots for fear of being jailed themselves. So it's really just an effort to try to make voting scary, to try to make it seem criminal, try to make it so that people won't do it. A lot of this is very reminiscent of Jim Crow, where yes, there were very obvious ways that people were disenfranchised during Jim Crow, but there are also very subtle ways that people were disenfranchised as well, by making it so complicated, by knocking people out on technicalities, by making it so that even if you wanted to do the right thing, you couldn't do so. That not every registrar in the South was terrible, but they were caught up in a terrible, racist, vicious system. And really what voter suppression is in many cases, yes, sometimes it's outright beating and lynchings and those kind of things. And other times it's administrative violence. And that's the kind of thing that we're seeing right now is Texas is disenfranchising people in a very, very bureaucratic way, but that doesn't make it any better. At the end of the day, if your vote isn't counted, it doesn't really matter how it happened. And so I think what we need to do is we need to support those election officials. We need to encourage people to stay election officials. A lot of people are getting frustrated and leaving, and then you have the insurrectionists taking their jobs. And we need to push to change these laws or to relax them. I know a lot of these efforts are being challenged in court right now, but I think really the idea that election officials should be able to do their jobs shouldn't be that controversial, and really until 2020 was not controversial.
It really shouldn't be. And I also want to do another shout out to League of Women Voters, who's been working so hard at the local level around this issue, particularly in Texas. Ari, let's move on to talk about redistricting. Can you walk us through the process of why and how congressional maps are redrawn every 10 years?
Basically, what happens is we have a census every 10 years that shows us what the population is and how it's shifted, and maps are drawn as a result. One of the really striking things in this census was just how diverse the country had become, more diverse than ever before, particularly in southern states with a long history of discrimination. Virtually all of the growth was from communities of color in places like Georgia and Texas and North Carolina. But the way the districts have been drawn in those states has actually been to increase representation for white people, particularly white Republicans, and to decrease representation for communities of color, even though all of the growth in the electorate is from communities of color. So this is blatantly racist. It's clearly discriminatory. I'm very concerned that far from striking this down, the Supreme Court is basically going to make it even harder to strike down this kind of racial gerrymandering. I think it's really important to note the Supreme Court has already said that partisan gerrymandering can't be even litigated in federal court. It can only be filed in state court. Therefore, blatantly partisan maps can't be challenged anymore before the federal courts, before the Supreme Court. However, racial gerrymandering under the Voting Rights Act was still unconstitutional, can still be litigated. But now the Supreme Court, in a case from Alabama, has signaled that it's possibly going to strike that down too. So you won't be able to challenge partisan gerrymandering in the federal courts. You won't be able to challenge racial gerrymandering in the federal courts. That means that all the litigation happens in the state courts. Some states have pretty good state Supreme Courts. Ohio isn't bad, North Carolina isn't bad, Pennsylvania isn't bad. Some states like Texas and Florida have really terrible Supreme Courts that are more terrible than the US Supreme Court. And so you're not going to strike down partisan or racial gerrymandering before the Texas Supreme Court. I mean, I would love to think that you will, but it's very unlikely that's going to happen. And so, I mean, I think we are heading to a situation where the courts, and this is not unlike the Jim Crow era, where they just completely wash their hands of any kind of racial discrimination in voting. And they either say, we're going to allow this explicitly, or we're not going to do anything to stop it. I think that's going to be very, very chilling, because historically, the Supreme Court has been a key role in striking down things like poll taxes and literacy tests, and upholding things like the Voting Rights Act. And that's only shifted in the last few decades. And the last thing I'll say is that by far, the most sophisticated and effective form of election rigging is gerrymandering. I mean, if you can create your own electorate, there is nothing more effective and suppressive than that. And what we're seeing across the board is that the number of competitive districts are just being completely wiped out, both in red and in blue states. And it's just a vicious race to the bottom. It's a race to the bottom between who can do the worst gerrymandering, New York or Texas, Illinois or Georgia. And that's happening because the Supreme Court has given all of this a green light. And so I think we really need to keep pushing for solutions to this problem, whether it's electing better people at the state court in places where there are state Supreme Court elections, whether it's trying to keep pushing for independent redistricting commissions, or where there are competitive seats, making sure that people are running for those seats and pushing the boundaries in the places where they aren't.
I think one of the judges in one of the recent decisions says, why are we letting politicians draw their own districts? Like that really shouldn't be the way it happens.
Yeah, I mean, on a fundamental level, it just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So while Congress continues to, for many years, not only to pass the Voting Rights Act, but then to reauthorize it, it was one of the most popular bipartisan pieces of legislation supported and reauthorized over and over, and not just reauthorized, but actually expanded. And even those presidents that might have been reluctant maybe to sign it had to, because of its massive support in Congress. So while this is going forward, and the last reauthorization is in 2006, you've got one track here, and then you've got the Supreme Court eating away at the Voting Rights Act through a series of decisions, and often using the framework or the language of equality in rulings that actually undermine the actual equality, in fact, of Black voters versus other voters. And I'm thinking here of some of the decisions like Shaw v. Reno, Miller v. Johnson, and ultimately, of course, changing that pre-clearance formula in Shelby versus Holder in 2013, which meant that states with long histories of voter suppression no longer had to get changes to state voting law pre-cleared by the federal government. And now we have this intervention by the Supreme Court in Alabama, allowing that map to stand. Why has it been so hard to fight these efforts that have reduced, in particular, the power of Black voters in the courts? Why has it been so hard for us to counter this targeting of Black voter power, especially when it's been under the guise of political redistricting?
Well, I mean, this is a 40 to 50 year strategy by the conservative movement to put justices on the court who would do this. I mean, John Roberts, who wrote the majority decision in 2013, gutting the Voting Rights Act, as I tell the story in my book, Give Us the Ballot, he was working in the Reagan Justice Department in the 1980s, trying to weaken the Voting Rights Act. So it's not like John Roberts woke up one day in 2013 and decided he didn't like the Voting Rights Act. He had a 30-year track record of trying to weaken the law. And indeed, he was put on the Supreme Court. He was elevated through the courts precisely because of that background. That's what the Federalist Society does. People like Gorsuch, like Kavanaugh, like Amy Coney Barrett, they don't come out of nowhere. They are being groomed because of, not in spite of, because of their radical views. on things like voting rights. And that was one of the stories I really wanted to tell in my book, was just how much of a consensus there was for the Voting Rights Act for so many years, just how bipartisan it was, just how enduring the majority was for it in the Congress. And really, this has only become controversial in the last decade. It's only in the last decade that you had the Supreme Court got the Voting Rights Act not once, but twice, and potentially a third time. Only recently did you have Congress decide they no longer wanted to support the Voting Rights Act. And it was really astonishing to me how you had 16 Senate Republicans who voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006 when it passed 98-0, who no longer supported the John Lewis Rights Act when it came up in 2021. And so I think we really just have to keep pointing out that the Voting Rights Act is not a partisan piece of legislation. It wasn't passed to benefit one party over another. It was passed to make America a truly multiracial democracy, which did not exist before 1965, and which we are at risk of losing today if we no longer have a strong Voting Rights Act. And I think it's not all we need. A strong Voting Rights Act only gets you so far, but I think it's very, very difficult to have a functioning democracy without a functioning Voting Rights Act. And I think we're seeing more than enough evidence of that right now.
Absolutely. I want to remind everyone who's with us that we welcome your questions to Ari, and we're going to be turning to those later in the program. So use the Q&A function and submit your questions. Thank you to everyone who's already been putting questions in. Of course, the big difference between 2006 and 2013 was the election of Barack Obama, our nation's first Black president. And so one has to think that contributed to, and of course, in Justice Roberts' decision and opinion in Shelby versus Holder was alluded to as, you know, gee, there's must not be too much racism anymore in our country when a Black president can be elected. Look, let's turn now quickly to the back end of the election system. If the front end is gerrymandering and voting rights, the back end is how do those elections get run? Who's tabulating the results? Ari, can you give us a few quick examples of how some of these new state laws have opened up election administration to extreme partisan actors?
Yeah, so I'll give you a really good example, which is Georgia, of course, the state that was ground zero for Donald Trump's efforts to try to overturn the 2020 election, where he told the Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes to nullify Biden's victory. And what Georgia did is they stripped that Secretary of State who stood up to Trump from being a member of the state board of election, gave that power to the gerrymandered Republican legislature instead, then gave the gerrymandered legislature the power to take up to four county election boards, the people that set voting hours and that certify election results. And they're currently doing an investigation right now in Fulton County, Atlanta, the largest and most Democratic and diverse county in the state, that could actually be taken over by the state election board. At the same time, local election boards are reconfiguring in such a way to purge Democratic members from those boards and to potentially replace them with Stop the Steal insurrectionist Republicans, who will then be in charge of how many drop boxes there will be, what the voting hours will be, whether there'll be weekend voting, and ultimately how results will be certified. At the same time, in Georgia, right-wing groups can mount unlimited challenges to voter eligibility after the election. Those challenges have to be heard immediately, or the county boards can be sanctioned, and that could also lead to throwing out votes. So I don't know whether any of this will happen, but you're seeing whether it's the threat of the state board of elections taking over county elections, whether it's county elections being reconstituted to empower insurrectionists, whether it's encouraging people to bring voter challenges. All of this is a recipe for Georgia doing what they refused to do in 2020, which was Donald Trump wanted them to throw out votes and overturn the election. They refused to do it. Now the law has been changed to make that easier to accomplish. I'm not saying they will do it,
Right.
But they have tools now that they didn't have in 2020. And that's the same thing that's happened in other states as well. So this election subversion to me is really, really scary. It's something that we have to start paying attention to now. People have to be aware for it now. People have to demand that their votes are counted. People have to be ready to file litigation immediately. People have to really monitor what's happening in these county election boards to an extent that they did not have to do in 2020, where we just assumed, okay, the votes are going to get counted and they're going to get counted accurately. That ultimately happened. There's going to be so much pressure on states not to do that in 2022, and even more so probably in 2024.
So thinking about how elections are tabulated and votes are counted, while the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act was sidelined in the Senate, some of the very people who worked quite hard to kill that bill have been working overtime on a legislative proposal called the Electoral Count Act. It was first floated in January as a red herring, really to distract from the more comprehensive and urgently needed Freedom to the Vote John R. Lewis Act. However, right now there's several different drafts of different ECA bills out there. What's your read on these, Ari?
Well, I think it's better than doing nothing. Put it that way. Really what the Electoral Count Act would do is it would fix the last stage of the election rigging process, which is when Congress counts electoral votes. And basically what it would say is it would make it, a reform of the Electoral Count Act would make it harder for Congress not to accept legitimate electoral votes or clarify that the vice president doesn't have the power to reject votes, which is what Trump wanted to do. He wanted Congress not to count the votes. He wanted Mike Pence to reject them. And the Electoral Count Act is antiquated and vague, dating back to 1887, and should be clarified. Now, I do think it was a red herring. I do think that Republicans dangled changes to the Electoral Count Act as a way to persuade Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema not to support the Freedom to Vote Act. I think that was ultimately successful. I don't think that was the only reason why they didn't support the Freedom to Vote Act, but I think that they believed that this was a fallback option they had. Again, it's important, but it doesn't do anything about all of the voter suppression, all of the gerrymandering, all of the election rigging that happens before Congress counts the electoral votes. And of course, it only deals with presidential elections. And the question is, how impactful will it be at the end? Because one of the things I'm really concerned about is state legislatures submitting their own electors in defiance of the will of the voters, which was also something that Trump wanted them to do. And I feel like any reform of the Electoral Count Act has to tackle that as well, because what if Georgia sends Congress an illegitimate slate of electors? Congress should have the power to reject that. And so this is really, really complicated. And I think, again, better than nothing. But it's hard for me to get really excited about reforming the Electoral Count Act when it would leave all of these existing gaps in the system.
Thanks, Ari. We're going to turn to all of your questions momentarily, but before doing so, I just want to mention right now we're approaching the 57th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March. And it was through the blood and courage of civil rights activists that the conscience of our nation was pricked finally. And they paved the way for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Workers' Circle is so proud to be among groups that are joining Black Voters Matter and many other voting rights and civil rights groups and leaders from Selma and Montgomery, people who were original participants in this march, and many of the co-sponsors of this program tonight, in marching in the footsteps of those freedom fighters to demand federal action on voting rights in coming weeks. We know that more is going to be demanded of us. Ari, from your vantage point of studying this centuries-long struggle to extend the promise of democracy to every single American, what would you have us remember as we prepare for what's ahead?
Well, I think it's really, really great that you guys are going down there. I was lucky enough to take 2 trips to Selma with the late, great John Lewis and members of Congress in 2013 and 2015. The first time we went right after the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. The second time we went in 2015 on the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, which was an incredible celebration with President Obama and so many other people. And these were really two of the most impactful trips that I've ever been on, to be able to retrace the footsteps of people like John Lewis, who nearly died marching for voting rights, was so incredibly moving. People, John Lewis has passed, but people are still alive who have those same experiences, who will be there. And I think really when you go to a place like Selma or Montgomery or Birmingham, when you spend time with people that fought these battles, you really understand the weight of this issue, that they weren't just fighting for voting rights, they were fighting for equal citizenship. They were fighting for basic recognitions of their rights, and that it wasn't just about getting the vote for the vote's sake. It was about getting the vote so they would have dignity, so they would have respect, so they would have equality. It was the first of many steps that we needed to take as a country, but it was going to be impossible for us to ever be a true multiracial democracy when people were being violently assaulted and disenfranchised simply for trying to exercise a right that should have been given to them from the very beginning of the country. And so I think it's incredibly important to remember it. I think one of the most important things is that to remember that, and this is very obvious right now, but to remember that the fight for voting rights is not a thing of the past. That one of the things that was really frustrating to me when I went to Selma was people like Jeff Sessions, Susan Collins, Rob Portman, Tim Scott. They were on these trips and they talked about how terrible it was what happened in Selma in 1965, but they refused to acknowledge the voter suppression that was ongoing today. So if you really want to honor what happened in Selma, you can't just look to 1965. You have to look at what's happening right now in 2022 in terms of making hard vote, and connect a link to the people that nearly died for voting rights on that bridge. They weren't just fighting for their right to vote. They were fighting for a right to end voter suppression and end voting discrimination once and for all. And we're a very long way from doing that right now.
Thank you, Ari. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we have. There's so many of them in the chat. And one question that I'm going to paraphrase from Jill Cody, and she's capturing the sentiments of so many people on the Zoom tonight. She wonders, how can those in states where voting rights aren't being threatened help those who live in states where voting rights are threatened? And a few people mentioned, I live, by the way, a minority white state. What can I do? Even my state's making voting harder this year. In other words, this is from one of our members here tonight. So Ari, what can people do when they live in states that aren't directly experiencing this right now?
Well, I would say every state is important for voting rights, because either what you can do is make it easier to vote to create an alternative model, or there's places that are supposedly progressive that have a long way to go on voting rights, like New York, where we had ballot initiatives that would have dramatically expanded voting rights, and they were defeated because people who cared about the issue didn't make it a priority. People were so concerned about voter suppression in Georgia, they weren't paying attention to expanding voting rights in New York, and that was something that was frustrating to me. So I think that there's something that you can always do in your own backyard. I think that's really, really important to know. But obviously, when it comes to helping people, you can give money to groups that work on these issues. You can travel to those places to help people. You can make phone calls. I think it's always good to talk to the people in those places and ask them, what do you need? I think that's the most important thing. Talk to Black Voters Matter. Talk to the New Georgia Project. Talk to the Texas League of Women Voters and say, what do you need? Do you need money? Do you need volunteers? Do you need phone banking? And they can tell you probably better than I can. But I just think it's important to have a grassroots approach to this, because sort of parachuting in is not always the best way. And one thing I will say is that I think we really, really need to pay attention to local elections and local offices. One of the things that happens is there's always the shiny candidate running for the Senate or someone that attracts a lot of money, and people aren't paying attention to who the Secretary of State is or who's running for their local positions. I mean, one of the things that's happening in a lot of states is insurrectionists are running unopposed to be county election judges. They're running unopposed to be election officials. And that's really, really frightening that we don't even have enough of a pro-democracy movement to make sure that someone is even being challenged for these kind of positions. So I think we really, while we look for a federal solution, we really need to look for how do you get involved at the state level and the local level in particular.
Well, that is stunning about county elections there. And all of us on this call are going to take that to heart. Let me also mention that those of you who want to have impact in Texas right now and in other states, the Worker Circle holds weekly phone banks with the Center for Common Ground, and you can check out Center for Common Ground. You can check us out on our website and join those phone banks to make a difference in other states, as well as while you make a difference in your own state. From Cynthia DeVore, Ari, we have a question here. Tell us more, please, about who is behind the Federalist Society, why they're so invested in voter suppression and what they get out of it.
Well, I mean, they want to create a system where the will of the people is nullified so that the power is concentrated in the hands of a wealthy few and that they can make decisions that counteract democracy in all sorts of ways, not just undermining the right to vote, but undermining clean air and undermining women's right to choose and undermining the rights of immigrants and women and poor people. I mean, this is a whole ideology, really, that I think these judges have now. And basically, it's an ideology to concentrate power in the hands of as few of people as possible. And so I think when you look at kind of the role of the courts, I think the courts are now the ultimate arbiter of this because they know that everything is litigated right now. And if you can control the courts, you can shape society. And not just that, but there's so little accountability on the courts as well because of how they're set up, that if you can get lifetime appointments at things like the Supreme Court, that's really pretty much the whole ball game. And I think that the right has understood that for 40 years. The left has been slow to understand that. Democrats still don't make the courts the same level of priority that Republicans are. I will say that Biden has been pretty good at appointing judges. I would say that if they do nothing else for the rest of the year, I would hope that they would just confirm as many judges as possible. But I think ultimately we need structural reform in this area. The idea that we are going to allow Mitch McConnell to kill the filibuster, to put 3 Trump justices on the courts, but not reform the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation, I think is something that's not going to go down very well in history.
Yeah. Ari, you're mentioning the courts, and one of the questions is, what about expanding the Supreme Court? Could that be a strategy that we ought to put our shoulder into at this moment? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we absolutely should expand the Supreme Court because I think 3 judges were confirmed in very questionable manner. That clearly Neil Gorsuch was in a seat that should have gone to Merrick Garland. Under the Garland rule that Mitch McConnell invented, Amy Coney Barrett should not have been confirmed. And Brett Kavanaugh never had a true vetting of the sexual harassment allegations against him. So, I mean, all 3 judges appointed by Donald Trump are questionable appointments at the very least. The Supreme Court, I believe, should be expanded to counteract that. Not to mention that 5 of 6 conservative justices on the court were appointed by Republican presidents who did not win the popular vote and confirmed by senators who did not represent a minority of Americans. So, I mean, the entire structure of the Supreme Court is, in my view, fundamentally illegitimate. And so I think we need to reform the Supreme Court. I don't think it's going to happen right now, just because if you look at the votes, there are not 50 votes to change the structure of the courts. But again, this is something that I think that Democrats should have been more aggressive at pushing. I think one of the things that probably the thing that I'm most frustrated about is the failure to enact any kind of structural reform by this Congress. The failure to add DC and Puerto Rico as states to counteract the fact that the Senate is so unrepresentative of the country, the failure to consider expanding the courts, to counteract the Republican rigging of the courts, the failure to pass voting rights legislation, to deal with all of these state level attacks. And I think Democrats are going to look back on, we had these majorities and what did we do with them? And I think the failure to pass fundamental structural reforms, I think is going to come back not just to haunt Democrats, but I think it's going to come back to haunt democracy more broadly. Because I think if you look at what Republicans do with the power they have, they always shape and manipulate democratic institutions to their own benefit, but the other side has not done the same.
I'll tell you, Ari, the question and answer log is just filling up. I want to
do
go
a lightning round.
A lightning round. Let me give you 3 questions right now. Can you say a little bit more about how voter suppression laws are impacting Native Americans in particular? You spoke about the radicalization of conservatives. Over time, how did this evolve? And then finally, I want to say there's some questions around how can we overcome legislation for profit attitude with our legislators. Sometimes it's not so much about parties as it is election officials and lawmakers being hostage to big pharma, the military industrial complex, et cetera.
Yeah, well, these are hard questions for a lightning round.
round.
I would say first on the Native American thing, I mean, you look at places like Montana, where Native American voters have to travel 200 miles to their closest polling place. And they've done things like making it impossible for community organizing groups to return those ballots, or getting rid of things like election day registration, or getting rid of things like drop boxes. And so it just makes voting more and more burdensome, because Native American communities, particularly if you're in a tribal community, are among the least served places. And so they are places where if you make it harder to vote, it really has a huge impact. In terms of the long-term strategy of the right, I mean, this was something that they started doing in the 70s and even in the 60s, when they saw the civil rights movement succeeding, when they saw progressive legislation passing, they realized they needed a response to it. And they've been organizing at the state level for 40 years. And I would just urge people, if you want to understand the voting component of that, I try to lay that out in Give Us the Ballot. And then in terms of people being bought off, I mean, I think that's why we need fundamental campaign finance reform. I think that was very, very clear that if you looked at Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, they weren't following the wishes of the broad majority of voters, even in their states. They were following the wishes of their largest corporate benefactors. And so, I mean, I think the defeat of the Freedom to Vote Act really showed why we needed the Freedom to Vote Act in the first place.
Well, Ari, we can't thank you enough for being with us this evening. We could just pose questions to you for hours. We so appreciate your expertise and the time that you've taken to share with us tonight. I want to let all of the folks on the Zoom know that we have some raffle winners who will each receive a complimentary copy of Ari Berman's Give Us the Ballot. Deborah Lockett, Lisa Reed, Diana Lamb, Valerie Street, Bay Seatwater. Congratulations to all of you. And I want to encourage all of you to stay on the Zoom call, because after Ari departs, after giving his last word, Jonathan Taubes, the Workers' Circle Jewish culture and justice advocate, is going to join me, and we'll have the opportunity to call into the Senate and make our voice heard. It's important to keep up pressure on our federal elected officials to do the right thing, to protect our democracy and to ensure voting rights. We're not giving them a pass. We're going to hold those senators who voted for the filibuster and refused to do rules reform to allow the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to proceed. We're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to thank those senators who voted in favor of rules reform, even though it didn't work this time, and tell them to keep fighting. We need everybody fighting for our democracy. So I hope you'll stay on the Zoom. But Ari, give us some parting words as we prepare to get out there and fight like mad at the state level, at the federal level, shoulder to shoulder for our democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Noelle, again, for hosting me. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, and to the Worker Circle and for all the groups for sponsoring this. And I would just urge all of you to keep up the fight and realize that, as the great John Lewis said, democracy is a state of mind, and it's something that we just have to keep fighting for every single day.
Thank you so much, Ari, and we look forward to seeing Minority Report when it comes out. All the best to you. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
I want to say a special thanks again to our 34 co-sponsors. What a joy it is to be working together with you. We know that we're stronger together, that we hold one another up, and that we won't stop fighting until we get this country turned around. And now I want to invite Jonathan Taubes to join us. And Jonathan's going to lead us through how we can make a difference right now by calling the Senate in support of federal voting rights legislation. Jonathan.
Thanks, Noelle. Thanks so much to Ari. And thank you all for being here with us tonight on the front lines of this crucial, really critical fight for American democracy. Now, in January, the Senate sidelined the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. They chose to protect the filibuster rule over the right of every American to vote and to have that vote counted. As you heard from the conversation with Ari, we need the Senate in this fight for our democracy. And so we need to let them know that. In a moment, we're going to be placing calls to our senators to either thank them for supporting voting rights legislation or to hold them accountable for failing to do so. Whichever way your senators voted, they really, really do need to hear from you, their constituents. And they need to hear that what you want them to do is to support comprehensive federal voting rights legislation. Now, with the exception of our friends from the District of Columbia, everyone else has 2 senators. And I do want to give a quick shout out for DC statehood, which is something that Ari mentioned earlier. That's very much a part of democracy reform as well. But for those of us with 2 senators, if you do not know your senator's party affiliation, you can look it up at the Senate website that we're about to drop into the chat. And remember, all Republican senators, every single one, voted against rules reform that would have permitted the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to advance. 2 Democratic senators, Manchin and Sinema, voted with the Republicans. And all of the other 48 Democratic senators voted for rules reform and would have voted to pass this critical bill to protect voting rights and our democracy. The slide, which will be up on your screen momentarily, has a script that allows you to convey your message depending on how your senators voted. I'm going to walk you through it, and all you're going to need, aside from that script in front of you, is your cell phone. So there you go. Now you can see it, hopefully. In the top left, you can see that number. That's the Capitol switchboard. So this is the number that we're going to call. And when you call, you're going to ask for your senators depending on which state you live in. So I'm just going to show you quickly how this will work. Let's say, for example, I am calling Senator Pat Toomey, a Republican senator from Pennsylvania. In that case, I'd say, hello, my name's Jonathan Taubes. I live, let's say, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and my zip code is, let's say, 19091. Senator Toomey, I'm calling to express my disappointment with your decision to protect state voter suppression laws and the filibuster instead of every American's right to vote by refusing to reform Senate rules to allow the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to advance. Then you'd move to the bottom to say, since January, over 250 new bills to restrict the right to vote and compromise independent election administration have begun moving through state legislatures. Voter suppression and partisan administration of elections have no place in our democracy. I urge your support for federal voting rights legislation like the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. I am counting on you. Congress must act, and our democracy can't wait. So that's what you'll say for any Republican senator and for Senators Manchin and Sinema. If you're calling one of the 48 Democratic senators who voted for rules reform, you'll say as follows. So let's say I'm calling Senator Gillibrand, who happens to be one of my senators since I'm from New York. I would say as follows. Hello, my name is Jonathan Talbus. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and my zip code is 11225. Senator Gillibrand, I'm calling to thank you for standing up for democracy and for every American's right to vote by voting for rules reform that would have permitted the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to pass the Senate by a simple majority. And you'll read those points at the bottom again, about 250 new bills to restrict the right to vote. You'll mention the voter suppression and partisan administration of elections have no place in our democracy. You'll say, I urge your support for federal voting rights legislation like the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. And finally, I'm counting on you. Congress must act. Our democracy can't wait. So now that you know how to do it, let's all make calls and let's make our voices heard. We're going to let our elected officials know that we demand they stand on the right side of history. And we encourage them to keep fighting for our voting rights. If we've learned anything tonight, it's that we want and we need to continue the fight for our constitutional right to vote and to free and fair elections. And just one last thing, we're going to be opening the chat now. So you can actually let us know the senators that you've reached with our message. And we really encourage you to please feel free to share who you've reached so we can all see the results of the collective power that we're harnessing together tonight. And without further ado, let's make some calls. Okay, folks, I've called my two senators and I'd love to see who people are reaching tonight with our message to defend democracy. Please feel free to share in the chat who you're calling. Okay, Richard left messages for Senator Markey and Warren from Massachusetts. Scott says he couldn't leave a message for Senator Dick Durbin due to high call volume. So I guess we're doing our job, but I hope you can reach him again. Wow, love to see this coming in, folks. Thank you, Michelle, Senators Padilla and Feinstein in California. We are all over the country tonight calling our senators together. Paula left a message from Marco Rubio. It's important for us to reach Republicans too. We are going to make sure that we pressure every senator to do the right thing here. And folks, as Noel is pointing out in the chat, do try to reach your senators via email if you can, and if you're not able to reach them with high call volume. They are receptive, and those emails and these calls do really, really make a difference. Thank you, Dion, for thanking Senator Maggie Hassan. Thank you too, Michelle. We're glad that you're with us. And we've got a couple New Hampshire folks, always nice to see. Very nice. Thank you, Mary from Connecticut, Senators Blumenthal and Murphy, both of whom voted for the reforms. Cynthia loves her Oregon senators, proud to leave a message for both Senator Wyden and Merkley's office. Indeed, strong leaders in this fight, and we need more like them. Thank you, Robin, for Senators Schumer and Gillibrand. Lots of New York representation here, but I love New York. I'm from New York, and it's always a good thing. Alice says, I've left so many messages, they probably know my voice by now. Those are the kind of activists that we need to save our democracy, seriously. Thank you, everyone. This is really, I hope this is encouraging for you all to see as well, because it is for me. Happy to see Rod from Oklahoma. Folks, we are all over the country, democracy activists from all across the United States of America. Thank you, Valerie from Texas, leaving 2 messages for both senators there. Alice from Vermont, I want to thank you, and I want to lift up your message. You called Senator Leahy to complain when he did not support changing the filibuster, but now he did. Our activism really can work, and so we really can win, and that's just, I think, a very, very heartening message that you shared with us. Thank you, Alice. Wow, we have so many fantastic activists from New Hampshire tonight. Love that New Hampshire representation. Okay, folks, let's hope a little more, a few more trickle in, hoping there's still some calls going, and we'll close out in just a few. And yeah, Jan, to Jan's question, Jan asked, is there a way to capture the script for use in emails? Most certainly. Please take it, use it, send emails, make calls. You can call back again. Tova calls herself the Bubby from Baltimore because she is a very concerned grandmother. And we love bubbies. We love concerned bubbies at the Workers' Circle. So we're very glad that you're with us tonight, calling from Maryland. That's right, Rod, who asks, the right-hand words are cut off at the top, and they've just been shifted because we have a wonderful tech team. And that should do it for you. Okay, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining the Workers' Circle tonight for Live from the Front Lines of the Fight for Voting Rights with Ari Berman. I want to thank all our wonderful co-sponsors for stepping up and joining us at this important event. And finally, I'd like to invite you all to join the Workers' Circle in our ongoing activism for voting rights and social justice. We are going to be leaving the script up for just a few more minutes for those who want to continue to make calls. Don't worry, please keep calling. Call tomorrow, call the day after that. But if you'd like to join us in our ongoing activism, we have regular Tuesday phone banks for voting rights and a whole lot of other stuff as well.